If you haven't seen my video on the history of the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd decade AD, make sure to check those out before you start this. The link will be in the description. This is a compilation of the Yearly History series on my channel, where we cover the history of the world every year. Let's get started. By this time, Emperor Tiberius has grown entirely suspicious of Sejanus's devious schemes. Tiberius, still residing in his villa on the island of Capri in semi-retirement, has recently received a letter from his sister-in-law Antonia. The written message details that Sejanus has been plotting to kill the emperor's grandson Gaius, the third son of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. Sejanus has pushed the limits of his power too far at last, and backed Emperor Tiberius into a corner where he can no longer ignore the Praetorian prefect's bold machinations. Without warning, Tiberius summons Gaius to Capri. A month later, Sejanus travels to Rome, where he is to be named this year's consul alongside Tiberius himself. In May, Tiberius unexpectedly resigns from his tenure as consul and orders Sejanus to do the same, though he informs him that he will be compensated with the office of tribune. Sejanus is now beginning to get suspicious and supposedly starts a conspiracy to topple Tiberius and name his young grandson Tiberius Gemellus as emperor, while he plans on pulling the strings from the background. Tiberius receives word of this scheme and decides the time has come to bring this affair to an end. The emperor summons Naevius Sutorius Macro to his villa and hands him a commission to replace Sejanus as the Praetorian prefect, or commander of the Praetorian Guard, along with a letter to be handed to the Senate denouncing Sejanus as a traitor. Macro is the current Praefectus Vigilum, also known as the Prefect of the Vigiles, the Roman Fire Brigade and Night Watch, so he's quite qualified. As the days pass and Macro makes his journey to Rome, Tiberius waits anxiously for a message detailing the outcome of the coup. Macro arrives in October and passes the instructions to the necessary parties. He greets Sejanus at the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine, where the Senate is meeting, and informs him that Tiberius intends to finally grant him his office as tribune. Once in the temple, the plan is set in motion as Tiberius's letter to the Senate is being read aloud. At the end of the letter, the order comes that Sejanus is to be seized as senators begin to denounce him one by one. Sejanus is taken by the present guards and handed over to the Vigiles, whom imprison him. Later that evening, Sejanus is strangled to death, and his body is dumped in public, where an enraged mob abuses the corpse of the hated official. Rioting and looting break out as the mob moves to lynch associates and family members of Sejanus. Before his widow commits suicide, she sends a letter to Tiberius, revealing the plot between Sejanus and Livilla against his son Drusus, which resulted in his death by poison in 23 AD. Livilla, in disgrace, stars herself to death on the order of her mother, Antonia. The chaos and retribution rages on in Rome as the year ends there. By this time, the lines between the followers of Jesus and other Jewish sects have become much more rigid, yet opinions about him from the outside seem divided. Quote, "Not every Pharisee or leader of a local synagogue opposed Jesus, but his claim to superior spiritual authority naturally irritated the existing leadership more than anyone else. Only the downtrodden and the outcasts had responded enthusiastically to Jesus' mission, probably because he held out a promise that their lowly status in this life would not prevent their salvation after death." Unquote. Jesus suddenly receives a warning from several sympathetic Pharisees that Herod Antipas intends to have him killed, much like he did to John the Baptist. Jesus chooses to leave Herod's territory, supposedly not out of fear, but rather that he feels his mission in Galilee has been accomplished. He begins a journey south with his disciples towards Jerusalem to face the Sadducees and the imperial power of Rome, where hostile reception awaits him. The mysterious divine acts that Jesus has been gaining a reputation for continue this year. While surrounded by a crowd of thousands gathered to witness his healing of the sick, he reportedly produces thousands of morsels of bread and fish out of 5 loaves and 2 fish. Later, on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus' disciples claimed to see him walking on water in the middle of a storm, which subsided once Jesus got on the boat. Another meteorological miracle is reported as Jesus and the disciples are once again in a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee in the middle of a storm, this one violent enough to frighten the disciples and lead them to request help from Jesus. Quote, "He then rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?'" Unquote. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was a powerful Roman statesman who rose to prominence as the prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius. He was appointed to this position as one of Tiberius's first acts as emperor, as they shared a close relationship, and Tiberius believed Sejanus to be quite capable. Sejanus quickly gained strong influence by reorganizing the Guard and consolidating its power in Rome, effectively making it a key instrument of political control. Eventually, he became the de facto ruler of Rome when the emperor withdrew to Caprae. However, Sejanus' ambition led him to plot against Tiberius and eliminate rivals, including members of the imperial family. His schemes were eventually uncovered, and Tiberius finally turned on him, orchestrating his downfall through a dramatic public arrest. Sejanus was executed, along with his supporters, and his family was brutally punished, marking the end of his once formidable influence on Roman politics. Velleius Paterculus was a Roman historian and soldier who served as a cavalry officer and later as a praetor under Emperor Tiberius. He authored a concise historical work, Compendium of Roman History, which spans from the early myths of Rome to his contemporary period, offering a favorable portrayal of the emperor and his family. The chaos surrounding the retribution against Sejanus and his associates continues on in the capital of Rome this year. But elsewhere, upon the summit of a high mountain, Jesus is in the presence of three of his closest followers, the disciples, Peter, James, and John. Jesus then begins to shine with bright rays of light. Next, Moses and Elijah suddenly appear, and he speaks with them. A bright cloud overshadows them, and a voice from the cloud declares, quote, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Unquote. Overcome with awe, the disciples fall face down, and when they look up, Jesus is alone again, appearing as before. To the disciples, this profound event reinforces Jesus' divine identity and his fulfillment of the law and the prophets. In another reported event, Jesus acts out his most impressive miracle yet. Lazarus, a close friend of Jesus and the brother of his friends, Mary and Martha, had fallen ill and died in Bethany. When Jesus arrived 4 days after Lazarus' death, Martha expressed her faith that God would grant whatever Jesus asked. Jesus declared, quote, "I am the resurrection and the life," unquote, and assured her that Lazarus would rise again. Jesus, deeply moved by the grief of Mary, Martha, and the mourners, went to the tomb. Despite objections about the odor from the decomposing body, he commanded the stone to be rolled away. After praying aloud to God to demonstrate his divine authority, Jesus called out, "Lazarus, come forth." Lazarus emerged from the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloth, alive and restored. These miraculous events continued to prepare the resolve of Jesus' followers for the increasingly difficult trials ahead. The supposed otherworldly acts by Jesus have borne witness to make them true believers that he is indeed the Messiah. Jesus has also been styling himself as the suffering servant, a title that links his identity as the Messiah with imagery of suffering and sacrifice described in Isaiah's servant songs. However, many detractors to Jesus still remain and reside in high office. He is accused of blasphemy, undermining religious authority, and generally being a threat to political authority. He continues his journey to Jerusalem as the year ends in this part of the world. In the east, the struggle continues between King Daimyo of Goguryeo against the powerful Han dynasty under Emperor Guangwu. Over the years, Daimyo has been making incremental gains, expanding his border by swallowing up minor states in the surrounding territory. Goguryeo attempted to inflict additional mayhem in China as they raided their territory at the height of their civil war, especially while it descended into a mess of feuding warlords at the collapse of the Qin dynasty and the restoration of the Han. Emperor Guangwu ordered the invasion of Goguryeo in 28 AD, but that endeavor was unsuccessful. As Emperor Guangwu is still dealing with rowdy warlords in the west, Daimyo orders an invasion of the Han client kingdom of Nakrong. This move is successful, and he defeats the army of Nakrong, cutting them off from Han suzerainty. Emperor Guangwu will have to address the more pressing threat of the aggressive warlords in western China before delivering his vengeance on Goguryeo. This year in Rome, the retribution against the associates of Sejanus continues on from 31 AD as some commit suicide or are executed. The frenzy of vengeance has taken complete control of the body politic as they rush to take out anyone they deem connected to Sejanus' damaging schemes. Emperor Tiberius himself orders the execution without trial of everyone imprisoned in Rome on suspicion of complicity in the alleged conspiracies of Sejanus. Quote, "There grew up a frenzied passion for bringing accusations, which increased till it became almost universal, and proved to be more destructive to citizens than any civil war," unquote, observed the Stoic philosopher Seneca. The bodies of the accused are tossed in the Tiber River to float away without proper burial. The chaos hits the Roman economy as well, as a financial crisis occurs as a result of poorly chosen fiscal policies. Land values plummet and credit is increased. These actions lead to a lack of money, a crisis of confidence, and much land speculation. The primary victims of this crisis are senators, equites, and the wealthy, as many aristocratic families are financially ruined. Tiberius responds by ordering a bailout. He makes a whopping sum of 100 million sesterces available to be lent out by the government to the elites who need it. The emperor's surprisingly swift response eases the tensions in the economy by the year's end. But as of now, at 73 years of age, Emperor Tiberius has sunk further and further into the depths of his depravity and depression at his villa in isolation on Capri. He writes to the Senate, quote, "My lords, if I know what to tell you, or how to tell it, or what to leave altogether untold for the present, may all the gods and goddesses in heaven bring me to an even worse damnation than I daily suffer," unquote. Another member of the imperial family is suffering in solitude on a Mediterranean island, in this case to a fatal degree. Agrippina the Elder, who was exiled to the island of Panditaria by Sejanus years earlier, now dies. She is said to have died from starvation, but it is not certain whether or not it was self-imposed. Tacitus says food was withheld from her in an effort to make her death seem like a suicide. As we reach spring in Jerusalem, crowds of excited pilgrims have flooded into the city en masse for the celebration of Passover, a Jewish holiday that commemorates the exodus of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Among the multitude of travelers is none other than Jesus of Nazareth, riding into town on top of a donkey, along with his entourage of disciples and devoted followers. As he enters the magnificent city, he is greeted by cries of those who have heard the good word, exclaiming, "Blessed be the kingdom of our father David," and "Hosanna," meaning "save us" or "help us now." The desperate onlookers are hoping for anyone to save them from the tyranny of Rome. On the road to Jerusalem, Jesus made it clear that he was aware of the hostile reception he would be receiving from the Jewish establishment, and that the possibility of him not making it back out is highly likely. Quote, "Because it is unthinkable for a prophet to meet his death anywhere but in Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets and stones the messengers sent to her," unquote. Upon arriving, Jesus heads straight to the temple, where he spends some time before leaving to the outskirts of the city in Bethany to safely spend the night. The next morning he returns to the temple, where he lashes out at the money changers and merchants, driving them away from using a sacred space for personal profit, in his cleansing of the temple. Quote, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of thieves." Unquote. Jesus spends the next few days teaching and healing in the temple, while also antagonizing the priests who constantly try to embarrass or provoke him. Agents of the Sadducees and Herodian allies soon begin to infiltrate his audiences, attempting to ask leading questions to get him in trouble. In one instance, a man asks if it is right to pay taxes to Caesar or Emperor Tiberius. Jesus points out the visage of Tiberius on the coin and replies, quote, "Then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," unquote, rebuffing their attempts to provoke him. Eventually, Jesus' opponents get exactly what they want. One day, one of Jesus' disciples declares his admiration of the magnificent columns, jewels, and decorative sculptures that adorn the temple. Jesus proclaims, quote, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another, every one of them will be thrown down," unquote. Supposedly, Jesus meant that the temple was the product of humans and would not last forever, but his words are twisted into a blasphemous prediction that the house of God is doomed for destruction. Before the Passover feast, the temple authorities decide they want Jesus to be arrested. They decide to make the arrest on this particular night, as they were tipped off that Jesus would be uncharacteristically spending the night within the city walls, sharing a meal with his disciples. In this Last Supper, Jesus shares bread and wine with his most loyal companions. Jesus shares a profound message with his disciples, preparing them for his imminent death. He emphasizes love and unity, giving them a new commandment to, quote, "Love one another as I have loved you," unquote. Jesus also institutes the practice of communion, symbolizing his body and blood through bread and wine, signifying the new covenant. He reassures the disciples of the coming Holy Spirit, who would guide and comfort them, and promises his eventual return to bring them into eternal fellowship with him. Despite his calm demeanor, Jesus already knows he has a traitor in his midst. The disciple Judas Iscariot has grown disaffected with his ministry, including his refusal to confront the Romans once he arrived in Jerusalem. This leads him down the path of betrayal, where he ultimately reveals Jesus' location to the high priest. Later, while Jesus prays in solitude, he is pointed out to the authorities by Judas through a kiss and is taken into custody. Jesus is taken to the house of the high priest Caiaphas, who had assembled a session of the Sanhedrin, a Jewish judicial and administrative body, and interrogates him during a trial. Jesus remains silent for the first portion of the proceedings, but eventually Caiaphas backs him into a corner where he does not deny being the Son of God. The Sanhedrin passes Jesus along to the higher authority, Pontius Pilate, stating that Jesus had claimed to be the king of the Jews, and had been causing disaffection among the populace in Judea, along with opposing the payment of taxes to the emperor, which was untrue. While these events were unfolding, Peter is supposedly recognized and accused of being a follower of Jesus 3 times, rejecting the notion each time, an act that fills him with intense guilt and shame. In a bid to embarrass the Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate sends Jesus back into their custody, suggesting the Jews need to settle their own theological disputes. The Sanhedrin angrily responds, reminding the prefect of Judea that any man who claims to be a king is defying the emperor, and they threaten to appeal straight to Tiberius. Pilate knows that Emperor Tiberius values order above all else and changes course, agreeing to take Jesus into his custody and personally interrogates him at the headquarters in Jerusalem. After some time where Pilate's questions get him nowhere, he has the bright idea to hand this Galilean over to Herod Antipas, who had come to Jerusalem to observe Passover. However, Herod has already learned his lesson about ordering the execution of religious leaders when he felt the backlash after his role in the death of John the Baptist 3 years earlier. In response, Pilate pretends he is prepared to let Jesus go free after nothing more than a severe flogging. The High Council passionately objects. Knowing his options are limited, Pontius Pilate sentences Jesus of Nazareth to death, and on Friday morning he is led up to Golgotha, a customary place of execution outside the city. A crown of thorns is placed upon his head, and the mocking title of the King of the Jews is written on a placard above the wooden cross which he is nailed to. Jesus is left on the cross for hours to suffer and toil alongside two others also being crucified. The Gospel of Mark claims, quote, "At midday a darkness fell over the whole land, which lasted until 3 in the afternoon, and at 3 Jesus cried out, 'My God, why hast thou forsaken me?' Some of the bystanders on hearing this said, 'Listen, he is calling Elijah.' A man ran and soaked a sponge in sour wine and held it to his lips on the end of a cane. 'Let us see,' he said, 'if Elijah will come to take him down.' Then Jesus gave a loud cry and died." Unquote. The disciples of Jesus have already fled by this time, fearing they would also be arrested. One of Jesus' wealthy supporters, Joseph of Arimathea, arranges for the body to be buried in a grave intended for a member of Joseph's family. They place Jesus' withered body in the tomb and seal the entrance with a large boulder. Reports from his mourning followers declare that Jesus rose from the dead on the 3rd day following his death and appeared to the disciples, harboring the nail wounds suffered during his crucifixion. In multiple encounters, he explained how his death and resurrection fulfilled the scriptures. He also tasks the disciples with the Great Commission, instructing them to spread his teachings to all nations. On the day of his ascension, Jesus led the disciples to the Mount of Olives. There, he blessed them and was said to have taken up into heaven, disappearing into a cloud. Time will tell whether Jesus' powerful message will fade into history, or whether his emboldened followers, through the Great Commission, will spread the word with zeal and passion and aid his teachings to live another day. Moving to China, where Emperor Guangwu is still contending with rebel warlords in the west. The rebel Wei Xiao dies, but is succeeded by his son Wei Chun, who takes up the baton of rebellion. In the south, the self-proclaimed Emperor of Changjia, Gongsun Shu, turns up the aggression factor to solidify his position as an independent ruler. He sends his generals Tian Rong and Yan Sen down the 3 gorges of the Yangtze to conquer the Nan Commandery, but they do not advance far. After meeting stiff resistance, Gongsun reassesses his own strength and reconsiders his future as the year ends. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Agrippina the Elder was a prominent Roman noblewoman and the granddaughter of Augustus. Married to Germanicus, a celebrated general, she accompanied him on military campaigns and bore him several children. After the mysterious death of Germanicus, Agrippina suspected Tiberius of being involved in his death, leading to increased tensions with the emperor. Her boldness and political aspirations made her a target of Sejanus' schemes, resulting in her exile and eventual death by starvation. Jesus of Nazareth, born around 4 BC in Bethlehem, was believed by the Christians to be the Son of God. Raised in Nazareth, he lived a modest life as a carpenter and began his public ministry at about 30 years old. Baptized by John the Baptist, Jesus preached about the kingdom of God, emphasizing love, forgiveness, and justice. His teachings, parables, and rumored miracles, including healing the sick and feeding multitudes, gained him a large following. He chose 12 disciples to accompany him and spread his message, often challenging religious authorities and social norms. Jesus proclaimed himself as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, styling himself as the Messiah and the suffering servant. His message of inclusivity and the forgiveness of sins resonated with many, but angered the religious elite and Roman authorities. In the final weeks of his life, Jesus entered Jerusalem, was celebrated by crowds, and shared a last meal with his disciples, instituting the practice of communion. Betrayed by Judas Iscariot, he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Jesus died on the cross, offering his life as a sacrifice for humanity's sins, according to Christian belief. On the 3rd day, he was rumored to have risen from the dead, appearing to his followers and affirming his victory over sin and death. His resurrection and ascension solidified his divine identity to his followers and laid the foundation for the Christian faith. The rabid witch hunt for Sejanus' associates, which reached a fever pitch last year, finally begins to subside significantly this year. Emperor Tiberius, in his old age and ever disdainful of political strife in the empire, makes it known that he wants stability to return to Rome. Elsewhere, over in the Caucasus region, the Roman client king of Armenia, Artaxias III, dies. He was placed on the throne by Germanicus on behalf of the Romans in 18 AD and has reigned without major issues since that time. After his death, the usurper, King Artabanus II of the Parthian Empire, steps in and places his own son on the throne, who takes the name of Arsaces. Emperor Tiberius refuses to recognize him as king, and arrangements are made to respond to this move by the end of the year. This situation will be sure to stir up the slumbering rivalry between these two superpowers. Last year in the Levant, we saw the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, but before ascending to the heavens, he charged his most devout followers with the Great Commission, a call to action to spread his teachings and to make disciples of all nations. This year in Jerusalem, a man named Stephen is selected as one of the 7 deacons appointed by the apostles to distribute food and charitable aid to poorer members of the community. The reason for his appointment to deacon is supposedly because of his strong faith and wisdom. The dissatisfaction among Hellenistic Jews is growing, stemming from their widows being slighted in preference to Hebrew ones in the daily distribution of food. Stephen is confronted by these Hellenistic Jews, but he bests them in a debate. Angered by this humiliation, they suborn false testimony, proclaiming that Stephen had preached blasphemy against Moses and God. He is then forced to appear before the Sanhedrin, the supreme legal court of Jewish elders, accusing him of preaching against the Second Temple and the Torah. Stephen responds by delivering a speech to the Sanhedrin, presenting his view of the history of the Israelites and accusing the Jewish leaders of resisting the Holy Spirit, betraying and murdering the Righteous One, just as their ancestors had persecuted the prophets. Seeing that the ravenous crowd can no longer contain their anger, Stephen looks up and cries, quote, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God," unquote. One by one, the crowd begins pelting rocks at the deacon as he prays until he finally sinks to his knees and dies. In the aftermath of the trial of Stephen, many of the remaining disciples deem it wise to flee to distant lands. One man taking an active role in the persecution of Stephen is Saul, a Cilician Jew and devout Pharisee, which is one of the major Jewish sects which sets themselves apart from others through their belief of resurrection, afterlife, and spiritual beings, and their expectation of the coming of a Messiah. He is also a pupil of the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, residing in Jerusalem, and has a reputation for persecuting Greek-speaking or Hellenized Jewish followers of Jesus. Even within 1 year of the crucifixion, Jesus' teachings have spread north to the Roman provinces of Syria and Cilicia. This causes great anxiety within the synagogues of Antioch. As a result, a counter-movement is ordered, and Saul of Tarsus is tasked with leading the backlash. On the road north to the Syrian city of Damascus, where he intends to oppose the newly converted followers of Jesus, he is supposedly confronted by a stunning bright light from the heavens. He suddenly hears a voice saying, quote, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" unquote. In awe, Saul falls down and asks who is speaking. The reply is, quote, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," unquote. Curiously, he discovers that he can now not see and is guided to Damascus, where he fasts for 3 days after his shocking experience. There, he is met by a disciple named Ananias, who is supposedly instructed by God to restore Saul's vision and fill him with the Holy Spirit. Saul is subsequently baptized and begins his transformation into a follower of Christ. His religious zealotry, that was once adversarially aimed at the followers of Jesus, is now converted to a deep sense of duty to spread the teachings of Christ to the Gentiles, which is a term used by Jews to refer to non-Jews. Slowly, he begins to shed his previous identity as Saul and adopts the name Paul. It seems as if the teachings of Jesus and the influence of his followers will live on for now, with the dedicated preaching of the disciples, and now the recently converted Paul. Moving to China, where Emperor Guangwu of Han continues his campaign to subdue the rebellious warlords in the west. In 30 AD, Wei Xiao, the commander of the Xizhou region, rose up in rebellion against the emperor, but was not successful and died last year. His son, Wei Chun, took up the cause after his death, but this year the imperial army captures his capital of Luomen, and he is forced to surrender. Also in the northwest, the rebel warlord Wei Ao comes into confrontation with the army of Emperor Guangwu. Wei Ao is notable for having crushed a contingent of the Red Eyebrows rebels who were searching for supplies in his territory in the past. He is no match for Emperor Guangwu's bolstered army though, and is forced to end his rebellion as well. With that, the emperor can turn the bulk of his attention to the only major threat remaining to his authority within his territory, that being the self-styled Emperor of Changjia, Gongsun Shu, who has been fighting for his independence and ruling a breakaway territory since 24 AD. These two have been endeavoring to deal fatal blows to one another from that point forward, but all attempts seem to meet tough resistance. A decisive confrontation between these two rival emperors seems to be on the horizon. Starting off the year in the Caucasus, we return amid the ongoing turmoil between the Romans and Parthians, competing to decide which power succeeds in installing its contender on the Armenian throne. Last year, the Armenian king Artaxias III died, and King Artabanus II of the Parthian Empire immediately moved to place his own son on the throne. He took the regnal name of Arsaces, but was immediately opposed by Emperor Tiberius of the Roman Empire. Armenia has mainly been a client of Rome, so he knew he would have to act swiftly in order to retain their influence in the region. To avert attention away from Armenia, Tiberius looks to Tiridates, a relative of Artabanus, as a new claimant to the throne of the Parthian Empire. Next, he places Lucius Vitellius in command of his eastern strategy. Vitellius held the position of consul the previous year, and is now named the Roman governor of Syria. Emperor Tiberius also takes the opportunity to find his own contender for the kingship of Armenia, that being Mithridates, a Pharnavazid prince of the kingdom of Iberia, being supported by his brother, Pharasmanes, the king of Iberia. In Armenia, the reign of Arsaces does not see a full year before his end. His servants are bribed to kill him, supposedly by Mithridates according to Tacitus, and they follow through by poisoning him. With the backing of Rome, the Iberian army immediately invades the kingdom, and they capture the city of Artaxata, its former capital. Artabanus, enraged by his son's death, retaliates by acclaiming his second oldest son, Orodes, as rival king of Armenia. When Orodes arrives with his army, he avenges the death of his brother Arsaces by executing the bribed servants who poisoned him. The armies of Orodes and King Pharasmanes of Iberia, on behalf of his brother Mithridates, eventually meet in a pitched battle, and the Iberian forces leave victorious. In the aftermath of the fighting, Orodes flees back to safety in Parthia, but not before the vengeful Artabanus threatens to invade Armenia with his army. But he retreats when Lucius Vitellius musters his Roman legions and stirs fears of a Roman invasion of Mesopotamia. A rebellion pops up in Parthia, and Artabanus is forced to flee to the remote borders of Scythia to reconsolidate his power. At this point, Vitellius urges Tiridates to take advantage of the situation. He leads the Roman legions and their allies to the banks of the Euphrates River, which they then cross. Vitellius, satisfied with the show of Roman power, encourages Tiridates to urge the Parthian nobles to obey him as their king, while respecting Rome, and then returns to Syria with the legions. By the end of the year, Tiridates' Roman-backed position is looking ever stronger in contrast to Artabanus. In approximately this year, the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo writes his symbolic interpretations of the Old Testament. Alexandria, where he resides, has a significant Jewish population, and he is currently their leading thinker. Philo's allegorical works, such as On the Creation and allegorical interpretations, reflect his attempt to harmonize Jewish theology with Greek philosophy. Another famous writer, Phaedrus, composes many of his famous works at approximately the same time. Phaedrus is a Roman fabulist, but was originally a Thracian slave who was later freed and became the first to adapt Aesop's fables into Latin verse. His fables, often featuring animals and moral lessons, emphasize themes of justice, power, and human folly, with stories like The Wolf and the Lamb illustrating how the strong oppress the weak, and The Fox and the Grapes, warning against dismissing what one cannot attain. Many of his fables are noteworthy for containing subtle political critiques of Roman society. Over in India, a newer state comes to full prominence around this time. Known as the Western Satraps, they are led by the Indo-Scythians, the same ethnicity of people who reign in the Northern Satraps, being a group of nomadic people of Iranic Scythian origin who migrated from Central Asia in the past. Most of its residents follow the Buddhist and Hindu religions common to this region of the world. It is worth noting that the Western Satraps had already existed as an entity before this year, but they became more firmly established around this time. In China, the duel between Emperor Guangwu of the Han Dynasty and his rival Gongsun Shu of Changjia continues. This time, the emperor makes a move and orders a two-prong invasion of Gongsun's breakaway territory, which he has ruled independently for over a decade at this point. Gongsun Shu counters by assassinating two of the Han generals that are in control of the imperial invasion. This has the intended effect of stopping the invasion in its tracks for the time being, although they do not retreat, but dig in and begin to reassess for now. Emperor Guangwu is on the cusp of returning complete imperial control to the Han Dynasty's territories after years of turmoil, but will have to reevaluate his next move. In Rome, a fire devastates the famous Circus Maximus, which lies in the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The Circus Maximus was first built in the 6th century BC under the early Roman kings, and is an enormous chariot racing stadium and entertainment venue, capable of holding up to 250,000 spectators. It has remained a central hub for Roman public games and spectacles for centuries, undergoing multiple expansions. Emperor Tiberius, now at 76 years of age, appoints a senatorial commission to assess the damage and generously donates funds to the victims from the imperial treasury. Last year in the east, Tiberius, through Governor Lucius Vitellius, sent Tiridates into Parthian territory to challenge Artabanus II's rule at a time when his position was severely weakened. Artabanus was forced to flee to the east after a rebellion against him started, and Tiridates was able to establish himself as rival king with the support of the Parthian nobles. This year, he gains the allegiance of additional cities that despise Artabanus for his cruelty, and are hopeful for a gentler rule from Tiridates, who had Roman training. He presses forward towards Ctesiphon, the capital of the empire, where he is crowned with the royal diadem, affirming his rule in the traditional Parthian manner. But at this point, the growing confidence of Tiridates causes him to make a fatal error. He squanders an opportunity to consolidate his rule by focusing on besieging a fortress wherein Artabanus had hidden his treasures and concubines, rather than advancing into the heart of the country to secure the loyalty of wavering tribes. This delay allows opposition to grow, as influential figures feel resentment and distrust towards his supporter, Abdageses. Thus, the powers behind Tiridates' right to rule defect to Artabanus. They eventually find him in Hyrcania, living in poverty and hunting for sustenance. The Parthian nobles disparage Tiridates as a weak, foreign-raised figurehead under the control of Abdageses, contrasting him with Artabanus, a true Arsacid. As Artabanus advances on Tiridates, the latter's forces quickly begin to abandon him, forcing him to flee back to Roman territory, leaving Artabanus to reclaim his authority unopposed. Moving to Judea, where the short-tempered prefect Pontius Pilate continues to anger the local population. This time, it's the inhabitants of Samaria. A new self-styled Messiah has aroused the religious fervor of the Samaritans by claiming he has knowledge of the location of sacred relics of Moses. His claims supposedly indicate that the relics lie in wait, buried on Mount Gerizim, the holiest place in all of Samaria. Receiving information that the zealous Samaritans had gathered arms and are assembling in a village at the foot of the mountain to begin their search, Pontius Pilate decides that he cannot allow this religious mission to transpire. The Samaritans feel the rediscovery of these sacred objects could possibly mark the beginning of a new age of religious enlightenment, which would threaten Roman imperial authority in the region. Josephus recounts Pontius Pilate acting as he, quote, blocked their projected route up the mountain with a detachment of cavalry and heavy armed infantry, who in an encounter with the first comers in the village slew some in a pitched battle and put the others to flight. Many prisoners were taken, of whom Pilate put to death the principal leaders and those who were most influential among the fugitives, unquote. In response, an enraged delegation of Samaritan nobles meets with Lucius Vitellius, the highly capable Roman governor of Syria, to argue for Pilate's dismissal from his post as prefect of Judea over his tyrannical rule. The level-headed Vitellius orders Pontius Pilate to return to Rome and appoints one of his own subordinates as temporary administrator in Judea. Also in the same part of the world, the Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, Herod Antipas, suffers major losses in his war with Aetas IV of Nabatea. We mentioned how Herod's own actions partly provoked this war in 27 AD, when he had cast aside his Nabatean princess bride to marry his cousin Herodias, which also had the resulting effect of stoking major resentment from his own subjects. Quote, Herod's army was destroyed by Aretas's forces, and this calamity was seen by many of the Jews as divine vengeance for John, called the Baptist, for Herod had put him to death, though he was a good man, unquote. This year in China, Emperor Guangwu's commanders looked to deal a fatal blow to his main rival, Gongsun Shu. Last year, they launched an invasion of Changjia, Gongsun's breakaway territory, but he retaliated by assassinating 2 of the Han generals, stopping their forward momentum for the time being. This year, they regroup and recommence with their invasion. They successfully surround Gongsun's capital of Chengdu and begin to besiege the city. The initial attempts are unsuccessful, and Emperor Guangwu considers ordering a withdrawal. However, he is convinced by one of his lieutenants to press on. Within Chengdu, Gongsun is lulled into a false sense of security, believing the Han forces to be actively collapsing from fatigue. He orders a sortie and is drawn out to engage in battle. In the ensuing fighting, Gongsun is mortally wounded, and the city Chengdu is forced to surrender. In the aftermath of the capitulation, the general Wu Han oversees the killing of more than 10,000 residents of the city, along with most of Gongsun's family. Control of Changjia is finally turned over to Emperor Guangwu, who had fully restored the Han dynasty in 25 AD, and with this victory has snuffed out all major resistance to his rule which has plagued him since becoming emperor. China is now reunified under his thumb, and the civil war is over. With the death of Gongsun Shu, Emperor Guangwu can turn the full attention of his exhausted army to the north. He takes the opportunity to bolster the fortifications along the northern border to defend from the Xiongnu. The pesky Xiongnu contributed to the chaos during the Civil War by supporting one of the pretenders and constantly conducting raids across the border. These new fortifications effectively blocked the traditional Xiongnu invasion route into Shanxi in northern China. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Gongsun Shu was a Chinese warlord and self-proclaimed emperor who established the Changjia regime in the west. Originally a Han official, he took control of the region around 25 AD, declaring himself emperor and resisting Han reunification under Emperor Guangwu for over a decade. His regime was prosperous, but isolated due to the territory's geography, limiting his expansion. In 36 AD, Han forces besieged his capital, Chengdu, where he was wounded in battle and later died, leading to the collapse of his short-lived kingdom. Kicking off the year in Rome, the elderly Emperor Tiberius is pondering the future of the empire once he is no longer around. At 77 years of age, he has recently named 2 successors in his will, following in the footsteps of Emperor Augustus, who was unsuccessful for some time due to multiple untimely deaths. Years ago, it seemed like the 2 eldest sons of Tiberius's adopted son, Germanicus, would be taking up the mantle, but Tiberius outlived both after they were targeted by Sejanus and exiled. Nero Julius Caesar died in 31 AD, and Drusus Caesar also died young in 33 AD. This leaves Gaius Julius Caesar, named after the legendary Gaius Julius Caesar of the late Republic, as the only remaining son of Germanicus. And so, Tiberius names Gaius, along with his grandson, Tiberius Gemellus, as joint successors in his will. However, Tiberius is not confident in the least about the abilities of these 2 very green imperial family members, although Gaius is tremendously popular among the masses. On the other hand, the Roman aristocracy has little confidence in the abilities of the young Tiberius Gemellus. Possibly to Tiberius's fault, he has never groomed Gaius and placed him in any positions of power like Augustus had done for him. Instead, he has kept him close by, traveling with him. Tiberius reportedly says about his main successor, quote, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people and a Phaeton for the whole world," unquote. Phaeton being the mythological son of Helios, who lost control of the sun chariot and nearly destroyed the world, implying that Gaius's rule would bring chaos. Time will tell how prophetic this statement will be. The political atmosphere in Rome remains tense, though not to the extent seen during Sejanus' tyranny. The current Praetorian prefect, who has forged a close alliance with Gaius, has recently begun to exhibit traits reminiscent of his notorious predecessor Sejanus. He has brought trumped-up charges of treason against his political opponents, one of them being the senator Lucius Arruntius, who chooses the path of suicide over a protracted trial. On his deathbed, he warns of the coming tyranny of the reign of Gaius once Tiberius is no more. And with that, we turn back to Tiberius, who in the early winter of this year has fallen seriously ill. In March, at his villa in Misenum, his health worsens and he slips into a coma. Thinking that he was dead, Gaius begins to issue the first orders of his reign, but Tiberius wakes up from his coma for a brief time, shocking those in Rome. But days later, he ultimately succumbs to the multitude of ailments and meets his end at the age of 77. Rome greets the death of the unpopular and reclusive emperor with rejoicing, believing that their savior, who would lead them past the political turmoil plaguing the later years of Tiberius's reign and restore Rome's glory, has come. People run through the streets shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," referencing the major river that runs through Rome, in which the corpses of hated figures are frequently cast into after their death. The Praetorian prefect Macro names Gaius as the new imperator. As emperor, we will refer to Gaius by the nickname he earned as a youth, residing in military camps while accompanying his father Germanicus on campaign. That name is Caligula, meaning little boots. Eventually, the Senate follows suit with Macro and transfers the imperial powers enjoyed by Augustus and Tiberius after him to Caligula. Caligula immediately seizes additional power as the late emperor's will, which named his grandson Tiberius Gemellus as a joint successor, is declared null, robbing him of his promised title. At Caligula's request, a lavish state funeral is held for Tiberius, but the Senate refuses to deify him as they did with Augustus after his death. The initial aggressive move aside, Caligula initially begins to make a very promising impression as emperor. Quote, Caligula unilaterally declared an end to the infamous treason trials of the last regime, recalled numerous exiles, and released scores of political prisoners, abolished the sales tax in the capital and the surrounding region, rescinded the ban against the publication of anti-Tiberian literature, and decreed further honors to his deceased parents. The Praetorian Guards were awarded twice as large a cash bonus as Tiberius had recommended in his will, and an equally liberal amount was distributed among the lower classes in Rome, unquote. Additionally, he sponsors the restoration of the Temple of Augustus, which Tiberius had allowed to languish. He also showers the thirsty public with extravagant public games, mainly chariot races in the newly renovated Circus Maximus. Everything is running smoothly until the autumn of this year. Caligula falls seriously ill, stemming from what is said to be a full nervous breakdown. In a panic, advisors strongly urge the emperor to name an heir. Shockingly, he passes over Tiberius Gemellus, who has the strongest case for being chosen, for his sister Julia Drusilla. This order does little to ease the concerns of the prominent Romans about his current state of mind. Prayers are offered throughout the empire for the imperator's recovery, and by year's end, he ultimately overcomes his mysterious ailment. But psychologically, he shows little improvement, remaining highly erratic and increasingly consumed by paranoia. One of the first victims of Caligula's apparent change in temperament is the adolescent Tiberius Gemellus, the grandson of Tiberius and the emperor's joint heir, whose succession was ultimately denied. Caligula either has him killed or induces him to do the deed himself, leaving no obvious contenders for succession. Elsewhere in the empire, a severe earthquake strikes the major city of Antioch, causing widespread destruction and loss of life. The tremors are so severe that buildings collapse, and aftershocks continue to shake the region, trapping many beneath the rubble. The severity of the earthquake prompts Caligula to dispatch 2 senators to assess and report on the city's condition. Eventually, he provides aid which helps with its reconstruction and relief efforts. In the Caucasus, we return to Armenia, where the new Roman emperor, Caligula, tries his hand in meddling in their affairs. Believing the recently crowned king Mithridates to be non-compliant and overly influenced by the Parthians, Caligula orders his arrest and deposition. In his place, he installs Orodes. Although a son of King Artabanus II of Parthia, he's a ruler Caligula sees as more aligned with Roman interests. Artabanus, in his weakened state, concludes a treaty with the Roman governor of Syria, Lucius Vitellius, in which he renounces Parthian claims over Armenia. Artabanus is coerced into traveling to Syria to formally acknowledge Rome's authority over Armenia. Despite this apparent diplomatic victory, Orodes, being the son of the Parthian king, is far more susceptible to Parthian manipulation, meaning their influence over the Armenian throne at this time outweighs that of the Romans. In China, the triumphant Emperor Guangwu of Han continues his tour de force after defeating his final rival and reunifying China. This year, he rewards his generals lavishly by granting them great wealth and control over large marches. This has the intended effect of reducing friction between him and his generals, thus allowing for their relationships to be preserved. Moving briefly to the Korean peninsula, where King Daemusin of Goguryeo elects to punish the former vassal of the Han dynasty, Nakrong. He invaded their territory in 32 AD and cut them off from Han suzerainty. This year, he decides to do additional damage and destroys the city with his army. After being brought to heel by King Daemusin, Nakrong is now under the control of the kingdom of Goguryeo. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Tiberius was born in Rome in 42 BC to the Roman politician Nero Claudius Drusus and the noblewoman Livia. Tiberius was married to Vipsania Agrippina, whom he deeply loved, but Augustus forced him to divorce her and marry Julia, Augustus's daughter. The marriage was unhappy, and this personal loss contributed to his growing bitterness. Possibly for this reason, Tiberius went into self-imposed exile on the Greek island of Rhodes for years, until being recalled in 4 AD, adopted by Augustus, and being named his heir after the deaths of Lucius and Gaius Caesar. A skilled general, Tiberius campaigned along the empire's borders, securing victories in Germania, Pannonia, and Dalmatia. After the death of Emperor Augustus and his accession to emperor, he was reluctant to rule and often seemed detached from political affairs. His reign became increasingly repressive, marked by treason trials and the ruthless influence of his advisor Sejanus, whom he later had executed. In 26 AD, Tiberius withdrew from Rome to the island of Caprae, leaving much of the empire's governance to his officials. His absence led to political instability, paranoia, and the persecution of perceived enemies. Despite his deep unpopularity, Tiberius was known for his frugality, avoiding excessive public spending and refusing to host grand spectacles. As a result, he left the Roman treasury full, ensuring financial stability for the empire. However, his reign is remembered more for its cruelty than its economic prudence. He died in 37 AD and was widely despised by the Roman people. And with that, Tiberius, who has been a part of this series since the very first episode, has passed on into eternity. This year in Rome, Emperor Caligula's paranoia intensifies, leading to a sharp rise in the persecution of his political opponents. One of the first major targets of his wrath is Naevius Sutorius Macro, the Praetorian prefect and his former staunch ally who played a key role in securing his rise to power. Caligula has started to see him as a threat and has him arrested, which leads to Macro committing suicide. Additionally, Caligula begins to show nothing but contempt towards the Senate. He seizes every opportunity he can to publicly humiliate them. The shift in attitude is possibly attributed to him poring over the transcripts of the treason trials held under Tiberius and Sejanus, and coming to the conclusion that the Senate should bear the lion's share of the blame for the political chaos. His harsh words do little to win the favor of the Roman aristocracy, further soured by his actions of bedding some of their wives and openly flaunting it. In his personal life, he loses a cherished family member. His favorite sister, Julia Drusilla, who he briefly named as his successor during his illness, passes away at the young age of 21. The illness which she succumbed to is unknown, but has been running rampant in Rome at this time. Caligula is devastated by this loss. He buries his sister with the honors of an Augusta and acts as a grieving widower. He has the Roman Senate declare her a goddess and proclaims a period of universal mourning on her behalf. In less than a year, Caligula's extravagant spending has managed to empty most of the treasury which Tiberius spent his entire reign frugally building up. By the summer of this year, he has convinced himself that his position as emperor requires him to display a grandiose image of wealth and grandeur to impress his subjects. Caligula orders his capable engineers to, quote, turn the sea into dry land, unquote, so he can ride across the water in triumph. To accomplish this puzzling request, they construct a bridge of boats across the Gulf of Baiae, topped by a road surface. Once this feat is accomplished, Caligula dons a cloak of gold cloth, studded with precious stones, and the breastplate of none other than Alexander the Great, while he rides back and forth across the bridge in a chariot, declaring that he has conquered Neptune. He then begins to dress as gods, goddesses, and other heroic figures, such as Neptune, Venus, and Hercules, further alienating himself from the Roman aristocracy. Another project of Caligula's vanity is completed this year, a duo of opulent ships intended for his personal use. The larger ship is an elaborate floating palace which contains quantities of marble, mosaic floors, heating and plumbing, and amenities such as baths. Elsewhere in the empire's second largest city, Alexandria, Caligula's well-known antipathy towards Judaism encourages a faction of anti-Semitic extremists in the city to launch a vicious attack on the Jewish community. Appian, a prominent Greek figure in Alexandria, had recently met with Emperor Caligula to complain about the Jewish community in the city. Appian's accusations were primarily focused on the Jews' refusal to participate in Roman religious practices and their distinct customs, which he claimed disrupted the social order of the city. Back in Alexandria, the city's predominantly Greek faction harbors growing resentment towards the Jewish community, fueled by their perceived collaboration with Roman authorities and the special privileges they are granted. The rioters seized the opportunity during the Jewish king Herod Agrippa's visit to the city to unleash their brutal pogrom. They mock Herod Agrippa's newly bestowed title as king, and then assault Jewish households and force the survivors into a cramped area of the city marred by pestilence and famine. Next, emboldened by the fact that the Roman emperor and governor of Egypt had both turned a blind eye to the violence, they begin to sack local synagogues and erect blasphemous statues of Caligula. All those Jews who protest are severely punished. Herod Agrippa immediately writes to his friend Caligula about the madness and complains about Governor Flaccus's behavior. Caligula takes heed of his word and has the governor banished and his estate confiscated. Ever since the last revolt against King Artabanus II's rule in Parthia in 35 AD, his position at the top has never been steady. This year, he is overthrown by a rival faction in favor of Cinemus, a man who has more support with the Parthian nobility and is declared king. Artabanus immediately flees to Adiabene, where its vassal king Isates II accepts him. Isates offers sanctuary to Artabanus, and recognizing the political instability in Parthia, begins to negotiate with the Parthian factions responsible for Artabanus's deposition, whom he still has influence among. The negotiations concern Artabanus returning to the throne to reduce tensions between rival factions in the court, and requires a full pardon for Artabanus's indiscretions, which ends in success. Cinemus steps down as king, and Artabanus is restored. No record exists of the fate of Cinemus. Returning to the story of Paul the Apostle, who has recently come back to the Levant after spending time in Nabatea, where he lived in solitude for the purpose of spiritual reflection, while others suggest he may have engaged in preaching and honing his rhetorical skills. He now arrives back in Jerusalem for the first time since converting to Christianity. The purpose of this return is to meet with Peter the Apostle, who has been the unquestioned leader of the Christians since the crucifixion, likely to gain practical guidance on the nuances of preaching the gospel of Jesus. Peter's recent activities have had an emphasis on missionary work towards the Jewish population of the region, traveling to Samaria and the coastal cities of Caesarea Maritima and Joppa. During his absence, the affairs of the Christian community in Jerusalem have been directed by the brother of Jesus, James, known as the Just, who converted after the crucifixion. Local sources say Paul also met with James on his brief return to the Holy City. At this point, Paul leaves Jerusalem on a journey back to his homeland of Cilicia to continue his preaching. 2 years ago, we saw Emperor Guangwu bolstering the fortifications along the northern border in order to prevent raids by the Xiongnu tribesmen. This year, he orders an extensive flurry of border bolsterings. This consists of the construction of a second line of defense across central Shanxi, a third to shield the Great Plain against attacks through Shanxi, and a fourth and fifth for the protection of northern Shenxi and the lower Wei River Valley. All walls are equipped with watchtowers and the usual apparatus for signaling. Nevertheless, this does not deter the Xiongnu from keeping up their raids, breaching or going around the fortifications, and roaming through large parts of the northwest at will. Since 33 AD, Chinese farmers who reside in the consistently plundered lands have been fleeing, which forced the emperor to issue edicts to aid in their migration. It appears as if this program will have to continue into the future. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Du Shi was a Chinese engineer, inventor, and government official of the Han Dynasty. He is credited as the first to apply hydraulic power by using water wheel-driven bellows to improve metallurgy, revolutionizing iron production. Serving as an administrator, he implemented various infrastructure projects that enhanced local economies. During the later years of Tiberius's reign, Caligula had become close friends with Herod Agrippa, one of the grandsons of Herod the Great. Upon the death of Tiberius, Caligula had awarded his new friend with the territories of his late uncle Philip, that being Batanea, Trachonitis, and Gaulonitis. He went even further by bestowing the title of king upon Herod Agrippa, which makes him superior to the notorious Herod Antipas, who holds the lower title of Tetrarch. This insult compels Herod Antipas to sail to Rome and appeal for the title of king himself. The mischievous Herod Agrippa takes advantage of Caligula's paranoia by accusing Antipas of being involved in the conspiracies of Sejanus and working towards building up armies and massive stores of weapons for a future nationalistic uprising against Rome, and intending to form an alliance with the Parthians. Although most of these accusations are false, Herod Antipas is forced to confess that he in fact does have large weapons caches, and in turn, this admission leads to Caligula sending him into banishment in Gaul. He strips Herod Antipas's title of Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea and bestows it upon his friend Herod Agrippa, making him the indisputable leader of the Jewish world. Although he has found a close friend in the Jewish king, Caligula's hostility towards the Jewish people continues. This is largely fueled by their steadfast monotheism and refusal to worship him as a deity. Tensions escalate further after a recent event where a mob in Judea destroyed an altar dedicated to him. Caligula avenges the insult to his godly divinity by ordering the erection of a massive gold statue of himself depicted as the god Jupiter in Jerusalem, which is to be set up in the temple. The new governor of Syria, Publius Petronius, who is made responsible for erecting the statue, faces mass demonstrations by the Jews of the region. In response, he successfully delays the construction of the statue for the time being, hoping to avert an even larger demonstration that would likely follow. Eventually, the statue is completed and taken to the city of Tiberias before Petronius senses trouble and orders its transportation to be halted. He requests that the emperor rescind his order, but another party has already come to Caligula concerned over this matter. Herod Agrippa himself has been pleading with the emperor to cease with his aggravating actions in Judea, claiming his territory would be ungovernable if he sanctioned the statue to be built in the temple. In the end, Caligula relents and dismisses his order to erect the statue. The emperor also makes a sudden journey to Germania in the summertime. Caligula had received warnings from his spies that the former consul and current governor of the province of Germania Inferior, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, had organized a plot to assassinate him. When Caligula arrives in the province, he ruthlessly suppresses the alleged conspiracy by having Gaetulicus killed and banishing 2 of his own sisters who were supposedly involved in the plot. Caligula remains in the region, traveling around Germania and Gaul for the rest of the year, ordering and then canceling multiple military expeditions into Germania, but still managing to declare victory. Now, taking a step back, initially, Caligula had abolished the treason trials that were widespread under Tiberius, earning him early popularity. However, by the end of this year, his behavior continues to become increasingly erratic, and he has revived the trials to eliminate perceived threats. This affair with Governor Gaetulicus seems to be just the beginning. The financial situation is also becoming increasingly unstable. Caligula's extravagant spending has quickly drained the vast treasury left by Tiberius, leading to a severe financial crisis. To replenish funds, he resorts to heavy taxation, confiscations, and extortion. His reckless expenditures, such as lavish public games and festivals, his palace, and his bridge across the Gulf of Baiae, have weakened Rome's economy and contributed to the growing discontent among the Senate and aristocracy. In China, Emperor Guangwu of Han continues to solidify his dynasty's rule by granting various noble titles to his sons and daughters. This has been a common practice among Chinese emperors to legitimize succession, strengthen imperial authority, and reward family members. He grants his eldest son with the consort Yin Li Hua the title of the Duke of Donghai. This title, given to Liu Yang, is a step below the position of crown prince, but still meant to grant him prestige and authority while keeping him out of direct succession disputes at this time. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Seneca the Elder was a Roman rhetorician and writer known for his works on declamation, a form of rhetorical training. Born in Hispania, he moved to Rome, where he documented the rhetorical styles of his time in his works Controversia and Suasoria, preserving the speeches and techniques of great orators. Though he lived through the eventful reigns of Augustus and Tiberius, he largely stayed out of politics, dedicating his life to scholarship and rhetoric. Emperor Caligula has remained in the north since arriving last year and is seeking military glory, but matters don't necessarily go his way. According to Suetonius, Caligula assembles a large force of soldiers and prepares for a naval invasion of Britannia. However, when the Roman forces arrive at the Channel, they do not launch a full-scale assault, but instead engage in a bizarre display of aggression. Caligula allegedly orders his troops to collect seashells as spoils of war, symbolizing victory over the ocean or the god Neptune, leading many to view this as a mock campaign. Whether this account is true or not, Caligula returns in failure as he continues to lose the respect of the military. The tumult for the erratic emperor is not over though, as in the summer, word of yet another conspiracy in Rome this time leads him to immediately rush back to the capital. Caligula has been hated by the senators and aristocracy since early on in his reign, but now the masses are beginning to turn on him in droves. This is in part due to his levying of crippling taxes to pay for his luxuries, including on sales of food and legal transactions. Most dangerously of all, he has lost the respect of the military, stemming from his embarrassing blunders on the front in Germania and failed attempt to land in Britannia. Emperor Caligula also initiates a series of reforms that fundamentally alter the nature of Roman rule, moving the Principate, the system of government created by Augustus, toward a Hellenistic autocracy. This marks a shift from the Roman Republican ideals of power sharing, where the emperor is considered the first among equals, to an absolute monarchy in which the emperor wields unchallenged authority. These actions lead to widespread unrest and opposition, with many Romans seeing Caligula's reforms as not just excessive, but also sacrilegious and tyrannical. Continuing on with the theme of his autocratic tendencies, Caligula breaks tradition by serving as sole consul without a colleague, a move that emphasizes his absolute authority and sidelines the disgruntled Senate. This bold decision reinforces his belief in his own supremacy, further alienating Rome's political elite. Additionally, he reportedly plans to make his beloved horse, Incitatus, a senator, either as a mockery of the Senate's incompetence or as an extravagant display of his absolute power. Whether with genuine intent or a symbolic insult, the act highlights Caligula's growing disdain for Rome's traditional institutions. In 38 AD, we witnessed how Caligula's disdain towards Judaism added fuel to the fire amid the tensions in Alexandria, leading to a massive anti-Jewish riot to break out. This year, the famous Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria leads an embassy to Emperor Caligula in Rome to protest the persecutions of Jews in the city. Philo's delegation ultimately fails, as Caligula dismisses their grievances and continues to insist that Jews worship him as a god, saying, quote, "You then despised my statue, which was set up with my authority and preferred to honor that of an unknown god." Unquote. The Roman client kingdom of Mauritania, headed by its king Ptolemy, has enjoyed the status of being one of Rome's most wealthy clients and has thrived under its suzerainty. This year, Caligula invites Ptolemy to a banquet in Rome. Once arriving, Ptolemy is confirmed as king and an ally and friend of the empire, but suddenly, out of nowhere, he is assassinated by the order of Caligula. Caligula's intentions are unclear, but after the client king's murder in Rome, his former household slave, Adrian, from outrage and out of loyalty to his former master, takes revenge against the emperor by starting a revolt in Mauritania with its Berber allies against Rome. Nevertheless, Caligula declares that Mauritania is to be incorporated into the Roman Empire, but it will take time to go into full effect with Adrian's revolt underway. One of the 12 disciples of Jesus, known as James, has found himself all the way across the Mediterranean Sea. Supposedly, while James is preaching in the city of Caesar Augusta in Hispania, he faces challenges and discouragement in spreading the teachings of Jesus. According to tradition, the Virgin Mary appears to him on a pillar, which was miraculously set upon a small stone column, offering him encouragement and support. She tells him to build a church in her honor at that location. In Parthia, King Artabanus II, who has been ruling the empire since 12 AD, dies in his late 60s. Immediately, a succession dispute arises as two of his sons, Vardanes and Gotarzes, lay down their claim to the throne. The elder son is the first to seize the opportunity and is proclaimed King Vardanes. Not much longer after that, Gotarzes seizes the throne, becoming the second of his name. Now, both men are supported by their own faction within the Parthian nobility. The elder brother Vardanes flees to Atropatene, where he takes refuge with some of his supporters. On the other hand, the younger Gotarzes finds support with the people of Hyrcania as the year ends in Parthia. Around this time, the Western satraps, a group of Indo-Scythian rulers who control parts of Western India, extend their border into the Deccan Plateau at the expense of the Satavahanas, who have ruled much of central and southern India for several centuries. The satraps supposedly take advantage of the Satavahana's weakened state, possibly due to internal strife and external pressures, to seize land and control lucrative trade routes. On the southernmost border of the Han dynasty, in the Nanyue region, a simmering volcano is soon to erupt. Quote, "Since the early years of the 1st century, the Han emperors had been content with a nominal acknowledgement of Chinese suzerainty by the Lac Viet tribes who occupied the Red River Delta, leaving management of affairs in the hands of local elites." Unquote. In the decades since, a large mass of Chinese immigrants have resettled in the south due to floods, famine, raids from the Xiongnu, and civil war, which upset the balance. The resident Lac Viet tribes have been pushed out of the fertile valleys of the Red River, and their way of life has been threatened. The Lac Viet tribes are a multilinguistic amalgamation of different peoples from across Southeast Asia that have migrated to the area over centuries. In that time, these people have evolved into a feudal society primarily dependent on agriculture. Recently, while the Han emperors were preoccupied with their own affairs, the people of the region remained subject to harsh sinicization efforts and taxation from the local governor. Sinicization being the process of making something more Chinese in character or bringing something under Chinese influence. In turn, the Southerners attempted to establish an independent kingdom. However, Emperor Guangwu's aggressive expansion forced them back under Han control, though they were still granted a substantial degree of autonomy. The tipping point comes this year with the execution of a local chieftain who is attempting to resist the Han imperial efforts to sinicize the population and subdue the tribal aristocracy. This has the exact opposite intended effect, as the widow of the slain chieftain, Trung Tak, and her sister, Trung Ni, rise up at the head of an insurrection and displace the local Han governor residing in Lien Lao. The rebels seize the city and proclaimed Trung Tak as their new queen of their independent Viet state. By the end of the year in this region, the roving bands of insurrectionists have marched up and down the coast, capturing dozens of cities and subduing the countryside. Just years after quelling the final remnants of civil war within his borders, Emperor Guangwu must face a harsh reality. An empire of this scale, home to diverse minority populations, will never remain pacified for long if its people feel mistreated. Now it's time for In Memoriam, where we look back on the lives of prominent figures who died in the year. Artabanus II, a member of the Arsacid dynasty, came to power in 12 AD after defeating Vonones I, who is seen as too Romanized by the Parthian nobility. His reign was marked by conflicts with Rome, including negotiations with Emperor Tiberius over Armenia. In 35 AD, he was briefly overthrown by Tiridates III, a Roman-backed rival, but he later regained the throne, with support from the Parthian nobles. Artabanus attempted to strengthen his rule by allying with eastern nomadic tribes, such as the Dahe and the Scythians, to counterbalance opposition from Parthian nobles. However, his reliance on foreign forces, his struggles against Rome, and his reputation for cruelty ultimately contributed to his difficulties in maintaining stability within the empire. Toward the end of his reign, internal strife weakened his rule, as he was overthrown briefly one more time in 38 AD before the end of his life. And that completes the history of the 4th decade AD. If you're curious about what happens next, please like and subscribe to follow the series in the future.